He ordered a wife by mail. He expected one woman to step off the train. 3 people stepped down instead. Caleb Reynolds stood frozen on the platform in Cold Hollow, Montana, the autumn wind cutting through his coat, and stared at the woman in the gray traveling dress holding a child against each hip. One was a boy, maybe 5, with a scab on his knee and suspicion in his eyes. The other was a girl, no older than 3, asleep with her thumb in her mouth. Caleb looked at the letter crumpled in his fist, the letter that had promised him a wife, 1 person, not 3. The woman lifted her chin and met his stare without flinching. "You're Mr. Reynolds," she said. It was not a question. "I am." His voice came out rougher than he meant. The letter didn't say anything about children. "No," she agreed, "it didn't." The train hissed behind her. The conductor was already calling for it to pull out, and in that moment Caleb understood that he had 2 choices: send them all back into the cold, or take them home. What he chose would change every life standing on that platform, but none of them understood the truth yet. Caleb Reynolds was 34 years old, though the lines on his face suggested more. He was tall and broad through the shoulders from 12 years of breaking land that did not want to be broken. His hair was dark, going gray at the temples too early. He had a quiet way of moving, like a man who had learned that the world punished anyone who got too comfortable. He owned the largest cattle ranch in the valley, 200 head, good water, a house he had built with his own hands. By every measure the men in town used, Caleb Reynolds was a success. But the house was empty, and it had been empty for 4 years. His wife, Ruth, had died in childbirth on a January night when the snow came down so hard the doctor couldn't reach them in time. The baby had died with her. Caleb had buried them both under the cottonwood tree behind the barn, and after that he stopped speaking to almost everyone. He worked, he ate alone, he did not laugh anymore. What no one knew was the fear that lived inside him. He was terrified of caring for someone again, because caring meant the possibility of losing them, and he was not certain he would survive a second loss. He had written for a mail-order bride not out of hope but out of exhaustion, a practical arrangement, 2 strangers sharing a roof, nothing that could break his heart. And now there were children he could lose, children whose small faces could wreck him. He should have been angry, instead he was afraid. Her name was Eliza Marsh, and she was 28 years old. She was not beautiful in the way the magazines drew women. She was tall and lean, with strong hands and a face weathered by sun and worry. Her hair was the color of wheat at the end of summer, pulled back tight. Her eyes were a pale, steady gray, and they did not look away from anything. Eliza had grown up on a hardscrabble farm in Kansas and had buried a husband of her own. Thomas had been a good man and a poor provider, and when the fever took him, he left her with 2 children and a stack of debts. The bank took the farm. The children's grandparents wanted nothing to do with a widow who couldn't pay her way. So Eliza had done the only thing she could think of. She had answered an advertisement for a wife, and she had not mentioned the children because she knew that if she did, no man would have her. It was a lie of omission, and she knew it, and she had done it anyway because Samuel and little Annie had to eat, and a mother does what a mother must. Her strength was that she was not afraid of work. She could plow, cook, sew, doctor a sick animal, deliver a calf, and shoot a rabbit at 40 yards. Her wound was harder to see. She had stopped believing that anyone would ever choose her, not the woman she pretended to be in letters, but the real, tired, fierce woman who came with 2 children and a heart full of fear. She expected Caleb Reynolds to send her back. They always sent women like her back. What she did not expect was the way he looked at her boy. Caleb's eyes had drifted to Samuel, who had planted himself in front of his mother and his sleeping sister, fists clenched, ready to fight a grown man twice his size to protect them. Something moved across Caleb's face. Eliza couldn't name it. "The wagon's this way," he said finally, and turned and picked up her trunk. That was all. No welcome, no anger, just a man walking toward a wagon in the cold. Eliza decided in that first hour that Caleb Reynolds was a hard man, maybe a cruel one. He hardly spoke on the long ride to the ranch. When Annie woke and began to cry, his jaw tightened, and Eliza pulled the child closer, certain he was counting the minutes until he could be rid of them all. And Caleb decided that Eliza Marsh was a woman who had tricked him. She had lied in her letters. She had come into his life under false colors. He told himself he would let them stay the winter, because no decent man turned children out into a Montana cold, and in the spring he would send them somewhere, anywhere, and have his quiet back. Both of them were wrong. They simply didn't know it yet. The first night set the tone for the war. Eliza found the kitchen and, without asking, began to cook. She found flour gone stale, coffee gone bitter, a pantry that told the story of a man who had stopped caring whether he lived or died. She made biscuits and fried salt pork and put real food on the table for the first time in that house in 4 years. Caleb came in from the barn, saw the food, saw the children at his table, saw the woman standing at his stove, and something in him recoiled. It was Ruth's stove, Ruth's table. "You didn't have to do that," he said, and it came out cold. Eliza's spine went straight. The children needed to eat, so do you by the look of it. "I've been feeding myself fine." "You've been starving yourself slow," she said. "There's a difference." The words landed harder than she intended. Caleb stared at her, and for a moment the air between them was sharp enough to cut. Samuel shrank back. Annie, sensing the tension, began to whimper. Caleb took his plate and went to eat on the porch in the freezing dark, alone, the way he had eaten for 4 years. Eliza watched the door close behind him and felt her stomach sink. She had come 1,000 miles to make a marriage, and she had started a feud instead. That night, lying awake on the narrow bed in the spare room with both children breathing softly beside her, she thought, "This will never work. He hates the sight of us." On the porch, Caleb ate his biscuits in the cold and hated how good they were. But Montana winters do not care about feuds. They force people together whether they like it or not. The change came slowly, the way ice melts, so gradual you don't notice until the river is running. It began with the boy. Caleb caught Samuel one morning in the barn, standing on an overturned bucket, trying to fork hay down to the horses because he had seen Caleb do it. The boy was too small for the job and too stubborn to admit it. The fork was bigger than he was. "You'll hurt yourself," Caleb said. "I want to help." Samuel's chin came up just like his mother's. "I'm not a baby." Caleb stood there a long moment. Then he knelt down, took the fork, and showed the boy how to hold it close to the tines, how to use his whole body and not just his arms. He didn't smile, but he didn't send the boy away either. When Eliza came looking, she found them working side by side in the gray morning light, her son chattering, the hard man listening. She stopped in the doorway and felt something tighten in her chest that she could not afford to feel. She backed away before either of them saw her. It began, too, with the work. Caleb expected the woman to wilt. The first hard frost killed 3 of his calves, and he braced himself for tears and helplessness. Instead, Eliza pulled on Ruth's old coat, waded out into the snow with him, and worked the frozen herd alongside him for 6 hours without a single complaint. When a cow went down in a drift, it was Eliza who figured out how to get a rope under her and haul her free. Her hands bled inside her gloves. She never said a word. That night Caleb watched her bandage her own raw palms by the fire and asked, almost against his will, "Where'd you learn to handle stock like that?" "Kansas," she said. "A poor farm teaches you everything or it kills you." He nodded slowly. He had misjudged her. He was beginning to understand that. A week later, the schoolteacher's husband broke his leg, and the man's animals would have starved before he healed. It was Eliza who organized the women of Cold Hollow to take turns with the chores, Eliza who rode out herself in the worst of it. Caleb heard about it in town, heard the women speak of her with respect, and felt a strange and unfamiliar pride that he had no right to feel. Then came the night Annie got sick. The little girl woke burning with fever, her breath coming short and rattling. Eliza knew the sound. It was the sound that had taken her husband. Panic she had buried for 2 years came roaring up. Caleb heard her crying out and came running in his nightshirt. He took one look at the child and one look at the mother's terrified face, and he did not hesitate. "I'll get the doctor. It's 12 miles, the snow. I know how far it is." He was already pulling on his boots. It was the worst storm of the winter. Any sensible man would have waited until morning. Caleb saddled his fastest horse and rode out into a blizzard that could kill a man, the same kind of blizzard that had kept the doctor away from Ruth 4 years before. Eliza understood, watching him vanish into the white, what it cost him. She understood that he was riding into the exact nightmare that had destroyed his life, riding into it for a child that was not even his. She held Annie through the long hours and prayed for them both, the child in her arms, and the man in the storm. He came back near dawn, half frozen, the doctor behind him. The doctor lanced the infection in the child's throat and broke the fever by noon. Annie lived. When it was over, when the danger had passed, Eliza found Caleb sitting alone in the dark kitchen, his hands shaking, and not from the cold. She sat down across from him. For a long while neither spoke. "You almost died out there," she said quietly. "I've done it before, the riding." No, she understood now. You couldn't save them, your wife, your baby. The storm kept the doctor away and you couldn't save them, and tonight you thought. "I thought I'd lose another one." His voice cracked on the word, the first time she had ever heard it break. "I thought I'd have to bury another child under that tree, and I couldn't do it again, Eliza. I couldn't sit and do nothing again." And there it was, the whole of his grief laid open on the kitchen table, the reason he had stopped speaking, the reason he had stopped living, the fear that had ruled him for 4 years. Eliza reached across the table and took his cold, shaking hands in her raw, bandaged ones. "You saved her," she whispered. "Do you hear me? You couldn't save them, but you saved her." Caleb looked at her then, really looked at her, the tired and fierce and beautiful real woman in front of him, and something that had been frozen solid for 4 years began, at long last, to thaw. That was the night the marriage began. Not on the platform, not on paper. There, at the kitchen table, 2 wounded people finally seeing each other. But seeing is not the same as trusting, and the past is not so easily buried. Spring came. The snow melted off the mountains and the valley turned green, and the strange family at the Reynolds ranch settled into something that almost looked like happiness. Caleb taught Samuel to ride. Annie called him Pa one afternoon by accident, and Caleb had to walk out to the barn and stand there a while before he could speak again. Eliza caught him smiling now, small smiles, but real ones. Then the past arrived on horseback. His name was Garrett Voss, and he was the children's uncle, Thomas Marsh's brother, a hard man with a lawyer in town and a paper in his hand. He had come, he said, to claim his late brother's children. He had means now, a house in Denver, and he had learned, he said with an ugly smile, that the widow Marsh had married a stranger under false pretenses, lying about the existence of the very children he had come to take. "No court," Voss said, "will leave 2 children with a woman who lies and a rancher who only married her by accident. You aren't even their kin," he said to Caleb. "You're nothing to them." Eliza went white, because the cruelest part was that it was true, she had lied. Caleb had never chosen these children. On paper, in the eyes of the law, Garrett Voss had every advantage. That night the house was silent and cold again. Eliza packed a bag in the dark, certain that the only way to keep Voss from dragging the children through a courtroom, from exposing her shame and Caleb's accidental marriage, was to take them and run before the hearing, to disappear, to free Caleb from the whole sorry mess she had brought to his door. Caleb found her at the door at midnight, with a child asleep on each arm. You're leaving. It's better this way. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were not. You never asked for any of this. I lied to get here. Voss is right, I'm not the woman you wrote for. Let me go and your life can be quiet again, the way you wanted it. For a moment Caleb said nothing. Then he stepped in front of the door. Quiet, he repeated. You think I want quiet? He took Annie gently from her arm and held the sleeping child against his chest, as if she were made of glass. For years I had quiet, he said. Quiet is the sound of an empty house. Quiet is eating supper on a porch in the cold because you can't stand to sit at your own table. I had all the quiet in the world, Eliza, and it was killing me by inches. His voice dropped. You and these children walked off that train and gave me back my life. And now you want to take it away to make things easy on me. I'm trying to protect you. Then stop running and let me fight. The hearing was held in the church, the only building in Cold Hollow large enough. Garrett Voss came with his city lawyer and his Denver money, and he laid out his case cleanly. A lying widow, a sham marriage, a man with no blood claim to the children at all. But Caleb Reynolds had spent the last weeks doing something Voss never expected. He had gone, hat in hand, to every family in the valley. The families Eliza had helped through the winter, the women whose chores she had done, the schoolteacher whose stock she had saved, the neighbors who had eaten at the table she set. One by one they stood up. The doctor told the court how Caleb had ridden through a killing blizzard for a child not his own. The schoolteacher's husband told how Eliza had organized half the county to keep his animals alive. Woman after woman, man after man, rose to speak for the widow Marsh and the rancher Reynolds, not as strangers who married by mistake, but as the heart of a community that had grown up around them. Then Caleb stood, and he did the thing he had not done in 4 years. He spoke from his open heart in front of every soul in Cold Hollow. I did right for a wife, he said, and the law is right. I didn't know about the children, but I'll tell you what I know now. I know that boy can fork hay and ride a horse and stand in front of a man twice his size to protect his family. I know that little girl calls me Pa and means it. And I know their mother is the bravest, finest woman I have ever met, and I would be proud to call her my wife not because some letter said so, but because I choose her. I choose all 3 of them. Today and every day after. He turned to Garrett Voss. You want to give them a house in Denver. I want to give them a home. There's a difference. I learned it this winter. The judge looked a long time at the children, at Samuel, who had moved to stand in front of his sister again, fists clenched, and at the whole town packed into the pews behind the Reynolds family. Then he looked at Garrett Voss, who had not once asked to hold the children, who had not once spoken their names with anything but ownership. He ruled for Caleb and Eliza before the noon bell rang. They were married properly that summer, under the cottonwood tree behind the barn, the same tree where Caleb had buried his first family. He had decided he wanted it that way. Not to forget the ones he lost, but to let the living grow in the same ground as the grief, the way wheat grows green over a field that has known hard winters. Eliza wore a dress the women of the town had sewn for her. Samuel stood up beside Caleb as a man would. Annie scattered wildflowers and ate half of them. And when the preacher asked Caleb if he took this woman, he looked at the tired, fierce, beautiful face he had once thought had tricked him, and he said, I do, like it was the truest thing he had ever known. He had ordered a wife by mail, expecting one quiet stranger to fill an empty room. She had stepped off that train with more than he bargained for, 2 frightened children, a lie born of desperation, and a heart that had stopped believing anyone would ever choose her. And in the end, that was exactly what saved them both, because Caleb Reynolds had not needed a quiet stranger. He had needed a family loud enough to wake him from his grief, brave enough to stand in his cold and empty house and light the fire again. He had thought she brought him trouble. She had brought him back to life. Years later, when their own children asked how their parents met, Eliza would smile and say it began with a letter, and a lie, and a man on a train platform who had every reason to send them away. And he didn't, Samuel, grown tall by then, would always add. He picked up the trunk and walked us home. That was the whole of it. A man who chose, against his fear, to carry the weight of strangers. A woman who, against all her certainty, was finally chosen. Under the cottonwood tree, the grief and the joy grew up together, season after season, and the house was never quiet again. And neither of them, not once in all the long years that followed, ever wished that it were.